Think your daily commute is rough? Or try surviving Tudor England, where the streets were filled with sewage, your thoughts could get you executed, and the king might chop off your head because he didn't like your outfit or your face. Disease was everywhere, medicine was guesswork, and religion could save you or kill you, depending on who was on the throne that week. This was a world where people died from spoiled beer, bacon falling out of chimneys, or just saying the wrong thing about the wrong person, where your chances of survival didn't just depend on luck, but also on which wife Henry VIII was angry with that month. Forget corsets and courtly love. This isn't the polished history you learned in school. This is the raw, brutal, bizarre reality of Tudor England, and you probably wouldn't have lasted a week. When Henry VII took the throne in 1485, England was still medieval in every sense. Life moved at the pace of a plough horse. Most people, over 90%, lived in tiny rural villages tied to the rhythms of farming. You worked the land from sunup to sundown, paid rent to a local landlord or monastery, and hoped for good weather and no plague. There were no supermarkets, no hospitals, and no social safety net. If the harvest failed, people starved. If a disease came, people died. It was as simple as that. But over the next 100 years, everything changed, and not always for the better. The Tudor period between 1485 and 1603 saw the beginnings of modern England. The old feudal world began to break down. Power shifted away from the nobility and toward a centralised monarchy under the Tudors. The church, once the most powerful institution in the country, was torn apart by Henry VIII's break from Rome. The monasteries were dissolved, their lands seized and sold off, and it shook the foundations of rural life. Whole communities built around monasteries lost their purpose and their income overnight. Meanwhile, a significant economic shift was underway. The enclosure movement began to take hold. Common lands, shared fields used by villagers for grazing and farming were fenced off and turned into private property, often for sheep farming. Why? Because wool made money, lots of it. Landowners found they could profit more from wool than from crops or tenant farmers, so thousands were kicked out of the land they'd worked for generations. Displaced, jobless and desperate, many moved to towns and cities. London's population exploded from around 50,000 people in 1500 to over 200,000 by 1600. The same pattern occurred in other growing hubs such as Bristol, Norwich and York. These early waves of urbanisation brought work for some, if you were lucky. For most, it meant overcrowding, filth and disease. Cities were not designed for this kind of population boom. Tudor streets were narrow, muddy and lined with open gutters. There were no toilets. Human and animal waste flowed freely down the street. People threw rotten food, bloody animal parts and even dead pets out of windows. It was a breeding ground for rats, lice and plagues. And with more people crammed into tight spaces came new problems: theft, drunkenness, fires and the spread of disease. Poor areas were especially hard hit. A single outbreak of the sweating sickness or bubonic plague could wipe out entire neighbourhoods in weeks. But the chaos wasn't just physical. Social roles were shifting too. A new merchant class began to emerge, comprising people who weren't born into nobility but had amassed fortunes through trade. This threatened the old social order. Laws were passed to regulate how people could dress, where they could live, and what they could spend. Tudor England was becoming richer, more connected, more powerful, and more unstable. And at the centre of it all were the Tudors, a family dynasty that promised strength and order, but delivered drama, upheaval and bloodshed. So yes, life under the Tudors may have brought peace to a country scarred by civil war. However, for the average person, it was a time of massive upheaval encompassing social, economic and spiritual changes. You weren't just trying to survive the weather or a bad harvest anymore. Now you had to navigate a dangerous new world shaped by politics, property, plague and power-hungry monarchs. By the late 1530s, Henry VIII had already scorched a path through 2 wives and plenty of political enemies. His first queen, Catherine of Aragon, had been cast aside when she couldn't give him a son. His second, Anne Boleyn, was executed on trumped-up charges of adultery and incest. His third wife, Jane Seymour, died shortly after giving birth to his long-awaited male heir, Edward. By 1539, Henry was 48. He was gaining weight. His leg wounds were festering, and the charm of his youth was long gone. But he still wanted another wife, partly for companionship, and partly in case anything happened to Edward, partly because a king couldn't be seen alone. Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, had risen from humble origins. His father was a blacksmith to become one of the most powerful men in England. Loyal, clever and ruthless, he'd helped Henry engineer his break from the Catholic Church and carried out the bloody dissolution of the monasteries. But with power came risk, and Cromwell's next task would be the one that cost him his head. Europe in the 1530s was a powder keg of religious tension. Catholic superpowers such as the Habsburgs, who ruled Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire threatened Protestant reformers in Northern Europe. Cromwell, a committed Protestant, sought to align England with other Protestant states, particularly the German territories, and a political marriage could seal such an alliance. Anne of Cleves was a prime candidate. She was the daughter of the Duke of Cleves, an influential Protestant leader in what is now Western Germany. Cromwell brokered the deal and had Henry's court painter, Hans Holbein the Younger, travel to paint her portrait. The painting depicted a modest and attractive young woman in traditional German attire, and Henry was intrigued. But here's the catch: Henry was expecting a fantasy, and in person Anne didn't fit the image he'd built in his mind. When she arrived in England in early 1540, Henry arranged a private meeting in disguise, like a boyish romantic gesture that went horribly wrong. He approached Anne unexpectedly, expecting a warm, flirtatious reaction. Instead, she barely acknowledged him. She had no idea who he was and responded stiffly. Henry was humiliated. He later described Anne as having a very evil smell and a body as loose and slack as though she had been ill. Whether that was true or not, we'll never really know. Modern historians generally agree that Anne bore a striking resemblance to her portrait, but Henry had made up his mind. He was not attracted to her, he was not going to consummate the marriage, and he blamed Cromwell. Yet the wedding went ahead in January 1540. Henry sulked through the ceremony and reportedly said he liked her not. The marriage was never consummated, and Henry quickly sought a way out. He had the union annulled just 6 months later, in July, claiming it was invalid due to his lack of consent and Anne's previous engagement, which had never been consummated either. Anne, to her credit, played her cards wisely. She accepted the annulment, agreed that the marriage had never been completed, and was rewarded with a generous settlement, several estates, a palace, and the honorary title, the King's Sister. She remained in England and outlived Henry and all his other wives. As for Cromwell, he wasn't so lucky. By this point, Cromwell had made enemies everywhere: nobles who hated his low-born status, conservatives who hated his Protestant policies, and even Henry himself, now humiliated by his failed marriage. The Duke of Norfolk and other court rivals pounced. In June 1540, Cromwell was arrested for treason and heresy. The charges were vague, probably fabricated, and entirely political. He was stripped of his titles and held in the Tower of London. On July 28, 1540, Cromwell was executed. Reports suggest the executioner made a mess of it, taking multiple swings to remove his head. That same day, Henry married his fifth wife, the 19-year-old Catherine Howard, a cousin of Anne Boleyn and niece of Cromwell's chief rival. the Duke of Norfolk. The message was clear. The court had turned, and Cromwell was the scapegoat. Holbein the painter who initiated the affair survived it unscathed, and his career continued, though his reputation at court cooled. The reality? Well, Henry may have used the portrait as a pretext for getting rid of Cromwell, whose influence had grown too large. Whether Henry was genuinely offended by Anne's appearance or was looking for someone to punish when his own body and pride failed him, we can only guess. The lesson? Well, at Henry's court, you could rise to the top of the world and lose your head over a painting. In Tudor England, thinking the wrong thought could literally get you killed. Under Henry VIII, the crown didn't just want your loyalty, it wanted your mind, your words, and your silence. After his break from Rome in the 1530s, the king wasn't content with ruling England's land and people. He declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, cutting ties with the Pope and reshaping the entire religious structure of the country. But this wasn't just about religion, it was about power. To enforce that power, Henry passed the Treason Act of 1534, one of the most chilling laws in English history. It made treason not just illegal, but punishable by death. To deny Henry that he was the head of the church, or wish harm on the king, even hypothetically, or call him a tyrant or a heretic, and even suggest he didn't have God's favour. You didn't need to pick up a weapon or lead a rebellion, you just had to say the wrong thing, or write it, or be overheard muttering it after a few too many ales. Suddenly, Tudor England became a place where your thoughts could be fatal. Treason Act was terrifyingly vague. It gave Henry and his ministers enormous freedom to silence critics, punish political enemies, and crush opposition. Ordinary citizens had to watch their words constantly. People were arrested for making jokes, engaging in drunken rants, or repeating rumours. And a poorly timed comment could mean a trip to the Tower of London and a one-way ticket to the scaffold. Even silence could be seen as guilt. Refusing to acknowledge Henry's supremacy was publicly perceived as a betrayal. It wasn't paranoia for the sake of paranoia, it was a calculated strategy. The act turned every subject into a potential informant, every conversation into a test of loyalty, and every thought into a possible crime. Henry's wrath wasn't reserved for random villagers. The Treason Act brought down some of the most respected people in the kingdom. Thomas More, a scholar, lawyer, and Lord Chancellor, More was one of the most brilliant minds of the Tudor age. He was also a devout Catholic who refused to support Henry's break from Rome, and More wouldn't swear the oath of supremacy, which acknowledged the king as head of the church. He remained silent, hoping that might protect him, but it didn't. In 1535, he was convicted of high treason. As he stood on the scaffold, he said, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first." Then he lost his head. The Bishop of Rochester, John Fisher, was another outspoken critic of Henry's religious reforms. Like More, he refused to accept Henry's supremacy. He too was executed in 1535. Pope Paul III had made him a cardinal in a last-ditch attempt to protect him. Henry responded by ordering his death before the Red Hat could arrive in England. Even the Queen wasn't safe. Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, was accused of adultery, incest and treason in 1536. Historians widely believe the charges were fabricated to eliminate her. Henry had tired of Anne, she hadn't given him a son, and her political enemies were circling, so he used the Treason Act to eliminate her. She was executed at the Tower of London with a French swordsman. Henry personally imported, perhaps to make the spectacle look more merciful. Cromwell, who we mentioned earlier, had also been one of Henry's closest advisors, and he also fell victim to the very laws he'd helped create. After the failed marriage to Anne of Cleves, Cromwell was charged with treason and executed in 1540. No one was too high or too close to the king to be spared. Thomas Seymour, the brother of Jane Seymour and uncle to Edward VI, Thomas was executed in 1549 after Henry's death on charges of treason. He had tried to marry the teenage Princess Elizabeth without permission, which was enough to be seen as a threat. The Treason Act created a culture of surveillance and suspicion. Letters were intercepted, servants were encouraged to report their masters, and neighbours informed on neighbours. People feared speaking openly, even in their own homes. And because heresy and treason were often intertwined, the lines between political dissent and religious belief were constantly blurred. If you questioned the king's divorce, you were a heretic. If you denied his role in the church, you were a traitor, and the scaffold became the final answer to the theological debate. So ask yourself this: would you have kept your mouth shut? Would you have survived in a kingdom where private doubts could lead to public execution? Because in Tudor England, one wrong word cost you your life. If you think modern life is risky, spare a thought for the average Tudor. In an age without health and safety laws, everyday tasks could be deadly. It wasn't war or execution that got most people, it was dinner gone wrong, dodgy substances in the pantry, or gravity doing its worst. This chapter isn't about plague or politics, it's about how people in Tudor England could die simply by living. No surprise, cities like London were filthy, overcrowded and full of food scraps, and rats were everywhere. And the solution? A white powder called ratsbane, also known as arsenic trioxide, cheap, effective and often confused with flour or sugar. In one recorded case, Barbara Gilbert, a housewife in Leicestershire, mistakenly used ratbane instead of flour while preparing a meal. She tested the food herself and died from the poison before anyone had even sat down. Another tragic story tells of a woman who got up in the night to fetch beer for her sick husband. In the dark, she grabbed a jug filled not with beer, but with a mixture of water and arsenic. Her husband drank it. He didn't get better. So why are there so many accidents? Well, because many households kept poisons in unlabelled containers, often stored in the same cupboards as food, and without proper lighting or modern packaging, one sleepy mistake could be your last. Now, clocks were a new and fascinating invention in Tudor times, symbolic of progress and wealth, but they were also lethal. In 1583, in the town of Mundane in Suffolk, a church labourer named John Townsend was repairing the large clock mechanism in the church tower. As he was carrying it down, the heavy weight slipped from his hands and plummeted from the tower. It landed not on the ground, but on the head of William Brett, a young boy passing below. William died the next day. This wasn't just a freak accident. As more clock towers went up across England, more people were hurt or killed by falling weights, slipping gears, or structural collapses. There were no safety harnesses, no warning signs, and certainly no lawsuits, and if something fell on your head, well, that was that. The Tudors loved their meat, especially pork. They smoked large slabs of bacon called flitches by hanging them in chimneys to dry out over time. It worked well until the rope snapped. Elizabeth Brown, a servant working in a nobleman's household, was sitting by the fire when a heavy flitch of bacon broke free from its rope in the chimney above. It fell directly onto her. She was crushed by cured meat. Her injuries were horrific. Despite the best efforts of household physicians, she died 4 days later. An inquest ruled it an accident, but her story became a cautionary tale about keeping chimneys clear and not trusting rope that had been soaked in smoke and grease for weeks on end. In Tudor England, water was often unsafe to drink. Rivers and wells were polluted with human and animal waste. So instead, people drank small beer, a weak, low-alcohol ale that was safer than water and consumed by everyone, even children. But relying on beer came with its risks, especially when containers weren't properly cleaned or labelled. Accidental poisonings were shockingly common, and beer was stored in reused arsenic pots, ale mixed up with cleaning chemicals. One slip of the hand in a busy kitchen or tavern, people died from what they thought was the safest thing to drink. Though not an accident, the death of Sir Thomas Overbury highlights how everyday substances could be weaponised. Overbury, a poet and advisor to court favourite Robert Carr, ended up in the Tower of London in 1613. He deposed Carr's marriage to Frances Howard, who was politically ambitious and already entangled in scandal. Overbury was imprisoned under pretences, but while there he was slowly poisoned. Arsenic slipped into his food and drinks. His body was found covered in dark patches and signs of internal decay. It took years for the truth to come out. Servants and jailers were executed, and Francis Howard confessed, but was pardoned. Technically, this occurred just after the Tudor period under King James I, but it still reflects the chaotic legacy of poison culture that was born during the Tudor reign. All these stories reflect a larger truth. Tudor England was a society in flux. New inventions, urbanisation, and changing ways of life created strange, unpredictable dangers. People were still figuring out how to live with technology, trade, and even food storage. There were no product labels, no emergency services, and there are no rules what to keep next to the flour. One mistake could end in tragedy. Life was fragile, and death often came from the most mundane corners of the home. So the next time you complain about safety warnings on everything from coffee cups to ladders, remember the Tudors. They didn't have too many rules, they had too few, and they paid for it with their lives. She was England's first official pregnant, the daughter of a Spanish princess and a king who broke the church in half for a divorce. She grew up unwanted, humiliated, and declared illegitimate. And when she finally sat on the throne in 1553, Mary Tudor had one goal: to put things right. By her definition, that meant burning Protestants alive. Mary was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife, and she was once heir to the throne. However, when Henry divorced Catherine and married Anne Boleyn, Mary's life was significantly altered. She was stripped of her title, forced to declare her mother's marriage invalid, and branded a bastard. She never forgave Henry, or Anne, or the Protestant religion that helped enable it all. By the time Mary became queen in 1553, England had seen years of religious chaos. Henry's split from Rome, the destruction of monasteries, and the brief Protestant reign of her half-brother Edward VI. Mary believed her duty was to save England's soul and bring it back into the Catholic fold. Once crowned, Mary moved quickly. She repealed Protestant laws and restored Catholic doctrines. The Mass was returned in Latin, papal authority was reinstated, and bishops ousted under her brother were reappointed, and the old heresy laws were revived. In 1554, the Heresy Acts were reinstated. These made it a capital crime to deny key Catholic beliefs, especially transubstantiation, the belief that bread and wine became the body and blood of Christ during communion. For Protestants, this was blasphemy. For Mary, denying it was treason against God. The message was clear: convert or burn. Between 1555 and 1558, around 280 Protestants were burned at the stake across England. Many more were imprisoned, tortured, or forced into exile. Whole families fled to the continent to escape the flames. The most infamous executions were those of the Oxford martyrs: Hugh Latimer, former Bishop of Worcester; Nicholas Ridley, Bishop of Lincoln; and Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury. These were not fringe radicals, these were senior church leaders, men who had shaped the Reformation in England. Their trials were public and their executions deliberate. Latimer famously said to Ridley as they were led to the stake, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England, as I trust shall never be put out." They were burned in Oxford in the centre of town, where the flames could be seen from the university windows. Cranmer was burned last. At the final moment, he held his right hand, the hand that signed the recantation, and into the fire first, letting it burn. Mary's religious campaign was closely tied to another ambition: securing a Catholic dynasty. At 37 years old, she was desperate to marry and produce an heir. Her choice: Philip II of Spain, son of the mighty Habsburg Emperor Charles V, who was a cousin. Many in England feared it would make the country a puppet of Spain. The marriage was deeply unpopular. Still, it went ahead in 1554. Philip was cold, politically calculating, and never truly interested in Mary. They spent much of their marriage apart from each other, yet she was deeply in love with him, and he tolerated her. Mary suffered at least 2 false pregnancies. In one, her belly swelled and she secluded herself for months, preparing for the birth of a child who never came. Today, some historians suggest she may have had a tumour, possibly ovarian or uterine cancer. She would die childless. Mary's reign was marked by rising discontent. Wyatt's rebellion in 1554 saw thousands of men rise to protest against her Spanish marriage, but it failed. But the message was clear: the English people weren't entirely behind it. Even Mary's religious policies met resistance. While some supported the return to Catholicism, the cruelty of the executions turned public opinion. Burning people alive was a brutal business. Entire communities would be forced to watch. The smell, the screams, the agony, it lingered in memory long after the flames died down. Mary died on November 17, 1558, at the age of 42. She was weak, ill and alone. Her final years were marked by despair. She believed she had failed. Her dream of a Catholic England had crumbled. The day she died, bells rang across the country, not out of mourning, but relief. Her half-sister, Elizabeth I, a Protestant, succeeded her and immediately reversed her laws. Catholicism was once again pushed aside, and Mary's short reign became a cautionary tale. The monarch who ruled through fear and fire. And her nickname? Bloody Mary. It stuck. Unfair? Possibly, but it captured the public's memory of her, a woman who tried to turn back the clock with smoke and ash. So why did Mary burn so many? Because to her, saving souls was worth more than saving lives. When Elizabeth I ascended to the throne in 1558, she inherited a kingdom exhausted by religious turmoil. Her half-sister Mary had tried to drag England back to Catholicism through fire and fear. Elizabeth, a Protestant, had survived that terror, and now she would flip the script. Under Elizabeth, Catholics weren't just out of power, they were hunted. And the man leading that hunt was Richard Topcliffe, the Queen's most feared and most ruthless enforcer. His job? Root out priests, break them, and kill them. Elizabeth wasn't initially out for blood. She aimed for a middle path, a version of Protestantism that kept certain traditions to satisfy moderates while still rejecting papal authority. But her tolerance only went so far. In 1570, Pope Pius V excommunicated her, and that changed everything. The papal bull declared Elizabeth a heretic and released her subjects from loyalty to her. In the eyes of Catholic Europe, Elizabeth was not a queen, but a Protestant usurper. Suddenly, Catholics in England weren't just different in their beliefs, they were potential traitors. The fear of Catholic plots grew fast, and in that fear, the Catholic priest became the new national threat. Richard Topcliffe was born around 1531 into a minor, noble family. He wasn't a soldier, a lawyer, or a priest. He was something worse, a man who made cruelty into a career. He held no official title, being a state agent, tasked with tracking down recusants, those who refused to attend Protestant services. But Topcliffe had one thing that mattered more than titles: the Queen's trust. He was loyal, discreet, and vicious. After 1580, when Jesuit missionaries began secretly entering England to support Catholics, Topcliffe was unleashed. He led raids on Catholic households, often in the dead of night. He searched manor houses for hidden chapels and priest holes, tiny, claustrophobic spaces built into walls and under floors to hide clergy. He interrogated servants, he threatened families. If a Catholic priest were found, he'd drag them to the tower, or worse. Topcliffe wasn't content to find priests, he wanted them to talk. If they wouldn't, he had methods. He oversaw torture sessions, and among his favourite tools were the manacles, where prisoners were suspended by their wrists for hours, dislocating their shoulders. The rack stretched the body until joints popped and ligaments tore, and scaffold drops lifting a man by ropes and suddenly letting him fall, snapping limbs but not quite killing him. One of his trademark moves, nicknamed Topcliffe's persuasion, involved a combination of these tortures repeated over days. He would mock prisoners while they screamed, and some he kept alive just long enough to confess the names of others and then had them executed anyway. Once a priest was broken, physically or psychologically, Topcliffe ensured they faced the harshest punishment, hanging, drawing and quartering. This meant being hanged by the neck but cut down before death, disemboweled while still alive, and then beheaded. Chopped into quarters with body parts sent across the kingdom as a warning. Topcliffe often attended the executions himself, not as a silent observer, but to gloat, spit insults, and even offer last-minute mercy if the victim would renounce their faith. One of his most notorious victims was Father Edmund Campion, a Jesuit priest and scholar. Campion returned to England in secret in 1580, aiming not to overthrow Elizabeth, but to minister to the English Catholic community. He was tracked down, arrested, and tortured by Topcliffe. Campion never confessed to treason, but it didn't matter. He was executed at Tyburn in December 1581, aged just 41. Even Protestant observers were shocked by his dignity and by the brutality of his sentence. Topcliffe didn't work alone. He ran a network of informants and spies, many of them disgruntled servants or neighbours who would report on secret masses, Catholic books, or whispered prayers. He blackmailed people into cooperation. If you knew a priest and didn't report them, you could be arrested yourself. The climate was one of pure fear. Families were ripped apart, priests were hidden like fugitives, and even loyal subjects were terrified of saying the wrong thing. Topcliffe, he was always watching. Topcliffe's cruelty wasn't rogue violence, it was government policy. Elizabeth's regime passed a series of harsh anti-Catholic laws. In 1571, it became treason to possess a papal bull. In 1585, it became treason to be a Catholic priest in England. And in 1593, recusants could be exiled or imprisoned for life. These laws gave Topcliffe all the cover he needed. Every raid, every interrogation, every scream in the tower, all of it was legal. Topcliffe died in 1604 just after Elizabeth's death. He was never punished, never even rebuked. Some sources suggest he eventually lost favour with James I, but he lived out his days with his reputation intact. In his writings he referred to his work as God's duty, and he believed he had saved England. But to others he was a man who blurred the line between loyalty and sadism, and enjoyed it. So what kind of country was Tudor England under Elizabeth? A place where praying the wrong way could get you torn apart in public, and a place where religion was national security, and like Topcliffe, was a secret weapon. If you were sick in Tudor England, your chances of recovery didn't just depend on what you had. It depended on whether your doctor believed your body was too cold, too hot, or too wet. Medicine in the 16th century was a strange and often deadly mix of guesswork, superstition, and inherited wisdom from ancient texts. People believed in astrology, in spirits, in the healing powers of bloodletting and crushed gemstones, but most of the time the treatment was worse than the illness. So let's take a closer look at the wild world of Tudor medicine and why seeing a doctor might have been the most dangerous decision of all. At the heart of Tudor medicine was the humoral theory, a system dating back to ancient Greece. According to this idea, your body was governed by 4 bodily fluids, or humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Being healthy meant these were in balance. Illness, they believed, came from too much of one humour or too little. The solution? Adjust your humours. Fever, too much blood, time to bleed you. Melancholy, too much black bile, try purging. And a persistent cough, must be an excess of phlegm, take warm herbs and maybe vomit. This theory shaped everything, including treatment, diet and even lifestyle advice, and it was utterly wrong. One of the most common treatments was bloodletting. If you were sick, the first step was often to drain your blood, literally. Doctors believed this would balance your humours and reduce inflammation or fever. There were 3 primary methods: venesection, cutting open a vein with a sharp blade; cupping, using hot glass cups to draw blood to the surface and slice the skin; and leeching, applying live leeches to suck blood directly from the body. Leeches were often used on older people, children or women, groups believed to be more delicate. It wasn't just a back alley practice, even royal physicians recommended it. King Charles II, though a Stuart, famously died shortly after being bled over a pint of blood in one day, along with doses of purgatives and enemas. Ironically, bloodletting often made people weaker, more anemic, and more likely to die from infections introduced by dirty instruments. If you weren't being bled, you might be poisoned in the name of healing. Arsenic and ratbane wasn't just used to kill rodents and rival nobles, it was also a legitimate medical treatment. Physicians prescribed it to treat skin diseases like eczema or psoriasis, syphilis, and general weakness, and even as a cosmetic to whiten the skin. Women, especially in court, prized pale skin. It was a symbol of nobility and purity. Many used arsenic-based face powders to achieve the desired ghostly look. One of the most famous users was Queen Elizabeth I. Her trademark white makeup, called Venetian ceruse, contained white lead and arsenic, and over time it caused skin deterioration, hair loss, and possibly contributed to her death. But she kept applying it. She had to maintain the image of the ageless virgin queen, even as the chemicals were eating into her face. Doctors also used some truly questionable methods to diagnose and treat illness, among them urine examinations. Physicians would study the colour, clarity, and even taste of a patient's urine to identify illness. Wound salve, some believed applying a salve to the wound that caused the injury, not the wound itself, could heal the victim. Toad powder was dried and crushed and were used to treat a wide range of ailments, including symptoms of the plague and nosebleeds. And then there were charms, prayers, and astrology charts. The time of your birth, the phase of the moon, and the alignment of the stars were all considered relevant to your health. The biggest problem with Tudor medicine is they had no idea germs existed. Disease wasn't thought to be caused by bacteria or viruses. Instead, it was blamed on bad air, sinful behaviour, an imbalance of the humours, and God's punishment. As a result, quarantine was inconsistent, treatments were ineffective or actively harmful, cleanliness wasn't always seen as a solution. Some doctors believed bathing too often weakened the body and opened your pores to disease. Public health was a contradiction. Streets were filled with waste. People tossed sewage out of windows, animals roamed freely, yet physicians insisted on dietary rules based on elemental theory, like avoiding cold fruits in winter. In the absence of practical medicine, people often turned to wise women, herbalists and folk healers. These figures, primarily women, mixed plant remedies with local superstitions. Sometimes they helped, and other times they were accused of witchcraft, especially when healing went wrong. Official doctors, mostly male and university trained, dismissed these women as quacks, but their success rate wasn't much better, and since formal medicine was expensive, most people never saw a real physician anyway. Medicine in Tudor England was a game of chance. If your illness didn't kill you, the treatment might, and the sad truth, most of what people did to get better only made things worse. Infections spread from filthy tools, poisonous chemicals were rubbed onto open wounds, bloodletting drained the sick only till they could no longer recover. Doctors, or those with the most power to help, are operating in total darkness. So next time you're annoyed at waiting 3 days to see a GP, remember, at least your doctor won't try to bleed you with a leech, smear your wounds with arsenic, or diagnose your illness based on the stars. Henry didn't start as the bloated tyrant we often imagine. In his youth, he was everything a Renaissance king should be: tall, athletic, charming, and cultured. He was fluent in multiple languages, loved music, wrote poetry, and could outjoust anyone at court. But by the end of his reign, he was something very different: paranoid, obese, violent, and consumed by physical agony. The same king who had once dazzled Europe now had to be carried on a stretcher, screaming in pain. So what happened? This is the story of how Henry VIII's body broke down, and how that breakdown may have turned him into one of the most dangerous monarchs in English history. When Henry came to the throne in 1509, he was just 17, 6'2", broad-shouldered and strikingly handsome. He was known across Europe as a model king. He spent hours each day riding, hunting and fencing. He played tennis, swam in the Thames, and jousted for sport. However, jousting was a risky endeavour, and Henry took the risk seriously. In January 1536, at the age of 44, Henry suffered a catastrophic jousting accident. He was unhorsed, knocked unconscious for hours, and his horse fell on top of him. Some accounts say he stopped breathing, his legs were crushed, one leg developed a wound that would never fully heal, likely an ulcer that became infected repeatedly over the next decade. This injury marked the start of his physical collapse. The wound on Henry's leg was more than just a sore. It was open, painful, and constantly oozing. It smelled, it required regular draining, often with primitive, agonizing tools. Walking became difficult. He grew irritable, he stopped exercising, and the weight piled on. By the 1540s, Henry had ballooned to around 300 pounds, morbidly obese by any standard. He could no longer climb stairs, armour had to be custom made, and servants carried him from room to room. He needed a special mechanical device to hoist himself onto his horse. Behind the closed doors of his palace, the once proud athlete was now a man locked in a decaying body. But it wasn't just his body that deteriorated. Henry's mind began to change too. He grew increasingly paranoid. Old friends became enemies. Advisors were executed. Wives were discarded or killed. His mood swings were violent and unpredictable. He could be charming and generous one day, but cold and brutal the next. Historians have speculated for years about his mental state. Some suggest chronic pain and infection played a role in his rage and instability. Others point to possible diabetes or Cushing's syndrome, both of which could explain his weight, mood swings, and ulcers. There's even a theory that Henry suffered traumatic brain injury from one of his jousting accidents, causing long-term cognitive damage. Whatever the cause, the evidence is clear. The Henry of the 1530s and 40s was not the same man who once wrote love letters to Anne Boleyn or hosted dazzling royal pageants. As Henry declined, so did the safety of anyone around him. His reign became bloodier. He ordered more executions than any other English monarch. He had two wives beheaded, Anne Boleyn in 1536 and Catherine Howard in 1542. He turned on Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, and many of his closest advisors. Nobles, clergy, servants, and even family members were not exempt from danger. The Treason Acts gave him legal cover to kill almost anyone for almost any reason. Thought crime, gossip, or even failing to show enough enthusiasm for his latest marriage could be fatal. His decisions were increasingly erratic. He married 6 times, changed his will, and flip-flopped on religious policy. Protestant one day, Catholic leaning the next. Nobody could predict his move. Henry's obsession with producing a male heir contributed significantly to his madness. He had 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. But for years, he saw only a son as the key to stability. His desperation led him to break from the Catholic Church, dissolve monasteries, and marry again and again. In the end, he had his son, Edward VI, through his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour. But Jane died days later, and Edward, though king in name, would rule only 6 years before dying at the age of 15. All Henry's efforts, all the blood spilt for a male heir, led to a brief, fragile legacy. By the final years of his life, Henry was isolated. His leg was so foul that courtiers reportedly gagged when near him. His temper had burned through friends and allies, and his health was failing fast. On January 28, 1547, Henry VIII died at Whitehall Palace at the age of 55. His coffin was so poorly sealed that during transport, bodily fluids leaked out and pulled beneath it, leading some superstitious observers to claim divine judgment, a gruesome end for a once golden king. Henry left behind a kingdom changed forever. He created the Church of England, seized religious wealth for the crown, redrew the map of English politics, and executed anyone who stood in his way. However, by the end, he was no longer ruling England. He was lashing out from behind a curtain, in pain, in fear, and decline. So who was the real Henry? The brilliant Renaissance prince who dazzled Europe, or the swollen tyrant who turned England into a kingdom of fear? Maybe both. However, it was the second one who did the most damage. The word witch didn't mean a pointy hat and a broomstick. It meant fear, suspicion, and often being a woman who didn't fit the mould. Live alone, use herbs for healing, argue with your neighbours. You might find yourself in court or worse, at the stake. The witch hunts of Tudor England were part of a wider wave of hysteria sweeping Europe, but they had their own uniquely English flavour. Rooted in religious fear, political instability, and plain bad luck, the Tudor witch trials reveal a lot more about society and about any actual belief in magic. Before the Tudors, witchcraft in England was seen as a minor issue. People believed in charms, spells, and folk magic, but it wasn't necessarily illegal. But that changed under Henry VIII. In 1542, Henry passed the first Witchcraft Act, making it a capital offence to use, devise, practice, or exercise any witchcraft, enchantment, charm, or sorcery to cause harm, and for the first time being labelled a witch could mean execution. So why the sudden crackdown? Well, because England was unstable, the country's religious landscape was shifting, the monarchy was shifting, and people needed someone to blame for failed crops, bad weather, illness, or unexplained death, and witches made an easy target. Most witches had one thing in common: they were women, often older, widowed, or poor. Many lived on the edge of their communities, both geographically and socially. Some were midwives or herbalists, offering folk remedies when licensed physicians were too expensive or unavailable. Others were simply unlucky, accused by neighbours after a quarrel, or blamed when a baby died or a cow stopped giving milk. If your cat looked at someone the wrong way, that could be proof you had a familiar spirit. If someone you argued with became sick the next day, that could also be evidence of a curse. And once you were accused, clearing your name was nearly impossible. The Tudor witch trials weren't based on hard evidence, they were based on panic and performance. Authorities looked for witch marks, moles, birthmarks, or scars thought to be signs of a pact with the devil. Accused women were often stripped naked and inspected. Some were subjected to swimming tests, bound and thrown into water. If they floated, they were guilty, because water was said to reject evil. If they sank, they were innocent, but they could drown before anyone pulled them out. There was no presumption of innocence. Torture, though technically illegal in English common law, was sometimes used anyway, especially under private questioning. One of the most notorious Tudor-era witch trials took place in the village of Warboys in 1593. A girl named Jane Throckmorton, daughter of a local squire, began having strange fits. She screamed, convulsed, and accused Alice Samuel, an elderly neighbour, of bewitching her. Soon other children in the household began to report the same symptoms. Alice and her family were arrested. Despite no objective evidence, she was blamed for the children's fits, and when the Throckmortons' patron, Lady Cromwell, also fell ill and died after confronting Alice, the case exploded. Alice, her husband John, and their daughter Agnes were hanged as witches. There was no real investigation, no scientific explanation, just mass hysteria and social pressure. Though not in England, the North Berwick witch trials of 1590 in Scotland are worth mentioning. They show how Tudor-era monarchs, even royalty, fed the fire of superstition. In this case, King James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, personally led the investigation. He believed a group of witches had conspired to summon storms to sink his ship during his return from Denmark. Dozens of people, primarily women, were accused of trying to kill the king with black magic. They were tortured, confessed, and executed. These trials had a lasting impact, and James' obsession with witches followed him to England when he became king in 1603. So why so many witch trials? Well, the Tudor period was full of instability, religious chaos. The country flipped between Catholicism and Protestantism multiple times in just a few decades. Economic pressure, enclosure, and rising prices left many rural communities struggling. And a fear of outsiders as social structures collapsed, people became suspicious of anyone who didn't conform. There was no scientific understanding of illness, crop failure, or sudden death that had a medical explanation. People filled the gap with superstition. In that atmosphere, accusing someone of witchcraft was a way to explain the unexplainable and to redirect blame away from yourself. The witch hunts didn't stop with the Tudors. They continued into the Stuart period and eventually crossed the Atlantic to the American colonies. The most infamous example, the Salem witch trials in 1692. But Tudor England laid the groundwork by combining religious fear, misogyny, bad law, and no medical science into a perfect storm of persecution. Hundreds were accused, many were executed, and almost all were innocent. So why were so many women burned as witches? It's easy, because they were easy targets, and because fear makes people cruel, and because no one asked enough questions. Now that you've walked through blood-soaked corridors, disease-ridden streets and courtly backstabbing of Tudor England, ask yourself, would you have made it out alive? It wasn't the romanticised world of velvet gowns and noble banquets. This was a society where death lurked in the shadows of power, poverty and paranoia. And most of the time, it didn't come from a sword, it came from the food you ate, thoughts you whispered, or the neighbour who didn't like you. Speak out against the king? Treason. Refuse to go to church? Treason. Draw the king's portrait the wrong way? Just watch your neck. Even silence could be dangerous if it meant you weren't enthusiastic enough about Henry VIII's last marriage. One misplaced word could get you beheaded, hanged, or worse. And that was before his legs started rotting and his temper went nuclear. Courts ran on fear, not fairness. The laws shifted with the monarch's mood. Henry, Mary and Elizabeth each used terror to shape the kingdom in their image. Religious loyalty was demanded, but it changed with every reign, from Protestant to Catholic, and every time the pendulum swung, people died. If you got sick, you were lucky if you didn't die from the treatment. Doctors guessed, folk healers risked being branded witches, arsenic, bloodletting and leeches were all standard options. Feeling unwell? Then you might need a leech on the face and some powdered toad, or maybe a priest, but you could be burned alive for making someone uncomfortable. Witch trials weren't about magic, they were about control. Poor, older or outspoken women were often targets, and once accused it was nearly impossible to prove your innocence. People floated or drowned, confessed under torture, and died for nothing. So, you've avoided the king's wrath, stayed quiet and kept your religion to yourself, that's great, but you could still die from rotten meat, contaminated beer, falling bacon, a clock crashing on your head, or the simple fact that plague didn't care who you were. So would you have survived? If you were rich, silent, healthy, lucky, obedient and invisible, then maybe. But most people weren't, and even the ones who were there didn't always make it. Because Tudor England wasn't fair, it wasn't safe, it wasn't kind, it was a place of ambition, brutality and survival. And that is what makes it so fascinating. Now if you made it this far, you're a survivor in spirit, even if your Tudor self might have been publicly executed by now. So subscribe to History Roadshow for more raw, riveting stories from history's most dangerous corners. Leave a comment, who's your favourite or least favourite Tudor figure? And don't forget to like and share this with your history-loving friends. Because of this story, it's only just beginning.